The Nortel collapse, the bugged boardroom. Imagine walking into your company's boardroom for the most critical meeting of the year. The future of your billion-dollar empire hangs in the balance. You're about to unveil your master strategy, your competitive edge, the secret sauce that'll crush your rivals. But here's what you don't know. Someone's already listening. Someone's been listening for years, and they're not on your side. This is the story of Nortel Networks, a Canadian tech giant that once stood toe-to-toe with Cisco, a company worth over $300 billion at its peak, employing nearly 95,000 people worldwide. A telecommunications empire that helped wire the modern internet. And it all came crashing down. But this isn't just another story about corporate greed or accounting scandals. This is about something far more sinister. This is about digital spies lurking in the shadows of executive offices. This is about hackers who didn't just steal data. They stole an entire company's future. This is the story of the bugged boardroom. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how invisible enemies can dismantle even the mightiest corporations, how your company could be compromised right now without anyone knowing, and why Nortel's collapse changed corporate cybersecurity forever. So buckle up, because what happened to Nortel could happen to anyone. Let's rewind to the year 1895. That's right, 1895. While most people think of Nortel as a tech boom darling of the 1990s, the company's roots stretch back over a century to the dawn of the telephone age. Originally called Northern Electric and Manufacturing Company, Nortel was born in Montreal, Canada, as a subsidiary of the Bell Telephone Company. Their mission? Simple. Build the telephone equipment that would connect a nation separated by vast, frozen wilderness. For decades, Nortel quietly dominated the telecommunications equipment market in Canada. They manufactured rotary phones, switchboards, transmission systems, the unglamorous backbone of communication infrastructure. They weren't sexy, they weren't flashy, but they were essential. Then came the 1990s. The internet exploded onto the scene like a digital Big Bang. Suddenly, the world needed fiber optic networks, wireless infrastructure, data transmission systems capable of handling billions of packets of information every second. The demand was insatiable, and Nortel was perfectly positioned to capitalize. The company transformed overnight from a stodgy equipment manufacturer into a darling of the dot-com era. Their stock price soared. At its peak in the year 2000, Nortel's market capitalization hit 398 billion Canadian dollars. That's roughly 300 billion US dollars. To put that in perspective, Nortel alone accounted for over one-third of the entire Toronto Stock Exchange's total value. One single company. Nortel was everywhere. They provided networking equipment for major corporations, government agencies, and telecommunications carriers. If you made a phone call, sent an email, or browsed the web in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a good chance your data traveled through Nortel equipment. They were competing head-to-head with giants like Cisco, Lucent, and Alcatel. They were winning contracts worth billions. They were innovating faster than almost anyone in the industry. From the outside, Nortel looked invincible. But inside the walls of their headquarters in Brampton, Ontario, and their offices scattered across the globe, something was very, very wrong. Here's a question that should terrify every executive, every entrepreneur, every business owner watching this. How do you know your company isn't compromised right now? Think about it. Really think about it. Your employees log into their computers every morning. They access sensitive files, read confidential emails, participate in strategy meetings via video conference. Your executives make decisions worth millions based on proprietary research, competitive intelligence, and trade secrets. But what if someone else is watching? What if every email is being copied? Every document downloaded? Every conversation recorded? For Nortel, this nightmare was reality. And the scariest part? They didn't know for almost a decade. Let me paint you a picture of what was actually happening inside Nortel's digital infrastructure. It started subtly. Maybe a suspicious login here, an unusual data transfer there. The kind of anomalies that could easily be dismissed as system glitches or employee errors. But these weren't glitches. Forensic investigators would later discover that hackers had penetrated Nortel's network so deeply, so completely, that they had essentially become invisible ghosts haunting the company's digital hallways. These weren't amateur hackers looking for credit card numbers. These weren't script kiddies defacing websites for bragging rights. These were sophisticated, patient, methodical operators conducting one of the most elaborate corporate espionage campaigns in history. Brian Shields, Nortel's senior systems security advisor, would later reveal the horrifying scope of the breach. In a 2012 interview, Shields explained that hackers had accessed the company's networks as far back as 2000, maybe even earlier. They had stolen technical papers, research and development reports, business plans, employee emails, and executive communications. But here's what makes this truly chilling. The hackers didn't just steal documents. They accessed the passwords of 7 top Nortel executives, including the CEO. Let that sink in for a moment. The CEO's password. Compromised. With those credentials, the hackers could read everything. Strategic plans for new products. Financial projections. Merger and acquisition discussions. Contract negotiations. Pricing strategies. Intellectual property worth billions. It was the corporate equivalent of someone installing hidden cameras in your home and watching your every move for years. And the hackers were careful, devastatingly careful. They would access the network, download specific files, and then vanish, leaving minimal traces. They used sophisticated techniques to cover their digital footprints. They understood Nortel's systems better than some of Nortel's own IT staff. Security logs showed that compromised executive accounts were being accessed from IP addresses in China. The logins happened during Chinese business hours. The hackers operated with impunity, confident that Nortel's security teams wouldn't detect them or couldn't stop them if they did. Brian Shields discovered evidence of the breach in 2004, but when he investigated further, he found that the intrusions had been ongoing for at least 4 years before that discovery. For years of unrestricted access. For years of stolen secrets. Nortel's response? They changed some passwords. They implemented additional security measures. But by then, the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Because here's the thing about corporate espionage. You don't need to steal everything. You just need to steal the right things. The product roadmap that tells your competitors what you're planning to launch next year. The pricing strategy that allows rivals to undercut you in negotiations. The research data that lets another company fast-track their own development without spending millions on their own R&D. Death by 1,000 cuts. And for Nortel, those cuts were fatal. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so Nortel got hacked. That's bad. But plenty of companies get hacked and survive. Why did Nortel collapse? Great question. And the answer is complex, because the hacking was just one piece of a much larger, much darker puzzle. Nortel's downfall wasn't caused by a single catastrophic event. It was a perfect storm, a collision of multiple disasters that turned a vulnerable company into a corpse. Let's start with the dot-com bubble burst. Remember when I mentioned Nortel's stock price hitting astronomical heights in 2000? Well, what goes up must come down. And boy, did it come down hard. When the dot-com bubble popped in 2000 and 2001, the entire tech sector imploded. Companies that had been valued at billions suddenly vanished overnight. Investment dried up. Orders were canceled. And telecommunications companies like Nortel, which had aggressively expanded during the boom years, found themselves dangerously overextended. Nortel's stock price, which had peaked at over $124 Canadian per share, plummeted to less than $1 within 3 years. Shareholders lost hundreds of billions in value. The company started hemorrhaging cash. But here's where things get really interesting and really shady. As Nortel struggled with the post-bubble reality, company executives engaged in what can only be described as creative accounting. Some might call it fraud. In 2004, Nortel announced that it had found accounting irregularities in its financial statements. Translation: the books had been cooked. The company had manipulated earnings reports, improperly recognized revenue, and misled investors about its financial health. The CEO, CFO, and controller were all fired. Later, they would face criminal charges for fraud, though they were ultimately acquitted after a lengthy trial. But the damage to Nortel's reputation was devastating. How could partners, customers, and investors trust a company that couldn't even keep honest books? Then came the 2008 financial crisis. Just when Nortel was trying to rebuild, restructure, and regain credibility, the entire global economy collapsed. Credit markets froze. Companies slashed budgets. Telecommunications carriers, Nortel's primary customers, stopped buying equipment. Nortel's revenue evaporated. On January 14, 2009, Nortel filed for bankruptcy protection. The once mighty Canadian tech giant was finished. But here's the question that haunts cybersecurity experts to this day. How much did the hacking contribute to Nortel's collapse? On the surface, you might think the accounting scandals and economic conditions were the main culprits, and they certainly played major roles. But consider this. Throughout the 2000s, as Nortel struggled, their competitors thrived. Chinese telecommunications companies like Huawei and ZTE exploded onto the global scene, offering products that were remarkably similar to Nortel's, but cheaper and developed in a fraction of the time. Coincidence? Huawei, in particular, grew from a small regional company to a global telecommunications powerhouse in less than a decade. How did they innovate so quickly? How did they understand the market so well? How did they always seem to be one step ahead in contract negotiations? Now, I want to be very clear here. There has never been definitive proof that Huawei directly benefited from the stolen Nortel data. No smoking gun, no confession, but the circumstantial evidence is, let's just say, compelling. Brian Shields, the Nortel security advisor, believed the Chinese government was behind the hacking. He stated publicly that he traced the intrusions to IP addresses in China and that the sophistication of the attacks suggested state-sponsored actors, not independent cybercriminals. Think about what that means. If a foreign government is systematically stealing your intellectual property and handing it to their domestic companies to give them a competitive advantage, how do you compete? How do you win when your opponents have access to your playbook? You don't. Nortel's collapse wasn't just about bad accounting or bad luck. It was about a company being systematically undermined, hollowed out from the inside, while invisible enemies stole the very innovations that might have saved them. Let's get technical for a moment, because understanding how Nortel was hacked is crucial to understanding how your company could be vulnerable right now. The hackers who infiltrated Nortel used a technique called Advanced Persistent Threat, or APT. This isn't your typical smash-and-grab cyber attack. APT campaigns are long-term, stealthy operations designed to maintain continuous access to a target's network while remaining undetected. Here's how it works. Phase 1. Initial compromise. The hackers likely gained their initial foothold through something called a spear phishing attack. Imagine receiving an email that looks completely legitimate. Maybe it appears to be from a colleague, a business partner, or even your IT department. The email contains an attachment or a link. You click it. That single click installs malware on your computer. The malware gives the attackers remote access to your system. And just like that, they're inside your network. At Nortel, once the hackers gained that initial access, they moved to Phase 2. Phase 2, privilege escalation. The hackers didn't just want access to one employee's computer. They wanted access to everything. So they used various techniques to gain administrative privileges, allowing them to move freely throughout Nortel's network. They identified high-value targets, executives, researchers, engineers, and systematically compromised their accounts. Remember those 7 executive passwords I mentioned earlier? That's privilege escalation at work. With executive credentials, the hackers could access the most sensitive areas of Nortel's digital infrastructure, strategic planning documents, R&D files, financial data, board meeting minutes, and merger and acquisition discussions. Everything. Phase 3. Establishing persistence. Here's where APT attacks get truly devious. The hackers installed backdoors, hidden access points that allowed them to return to Nortel's network even if their initial entry point was discovered and closed. They created multiple redundant pathways into the system. If security teams blocked one access point, the hackers simply used another. They were like digital cockroaches, nearly impossible to fully exterminate. Phase 4. Data exfiltration. Once embedded in the network, the hackers began systematically stealing data. But they were patient. They didn't grab everything at once, which might trigger security alerts. Instead, they slowly, methodically copied files and transferred them to external servers. Forensic analysis later showed that tens of thousands of documents were stolen over the course of years. Technical specifications, source code, customer lists, strategic plans, literally anything that could give Nortel's competitors an advantage. Phase 5. Covering tracks. Throughout all of this, the hackers were careful to cover their digital fingerprints. They deleted logs, used encryption to hide their communications, and routed their connections through multiple proxy servers to obscure their true location. By the time Brian Shields discovered the breach in 2004, the hackers had already been inside Nortel's systems for at least 4 years. For years of unrestricted access. For years during which Nortel's most valuable secrets were being copied and delivered to their competitors. And here's the most disturbing part. Even after the breach was discovered, Nortel struggled to fully remove the hackers from their network. The adversaries had embedded themselves so deeply that cleaning the systems would have required shutting down critical infrastructure, something a struggling company couldn't afford to do. It's like discovering termites have been eating your house's foundation for years. By the time you find them, the structural damage is already done. Let's pause for a moment and talk about something that often gets overlooked in stories about corporate collapse: the human cost. When Nortel filed for bankruptcy in 2009, nearly 95,000 people lost their jobs. 95,000 employees, from janitors to executives, suddenly found themselves unemployed in the middle of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Thousands of those employees were Canadians who had dedicated their entire careers to Nortel. They'd worked there for 20, 30, or even 40 years. They believed in the company. They'd tied their retirement savings to Nortel stock. And they lost everything. Retirees who had counted on Nortel pensions found those pensions slashed or eliminated entirely. Life savings evaporated. People who had planned for comfortable retirements suddenly faced poverty. Engineers and researchers who had developed cutting-edge technology, who had poured their creativity and expertise into innovations they believed would change the world, watched as their work was either sold off for pennies or, worse, may have been stolen and used by competitors. There's a particularly heartbreaking aspect to the Nortel story that doesn't get enough attention. Many of the employees suspected for years that something was wrong. Security researchers like Brian Shields raised red flags about the cyber attacks. Engineers noticed that competing products seemed suspiciously similar to Nortel designs. But in the corporate culture of the time, these warnings were often dismissed or downplayed. Management was focused on hitting quarterly earnings targets, appeasing shareholders, and maintaining stock prices. Cybersecurity was seen as an IT problem, not a strategic business priority. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in corporate disasters. The people on the ground, the technicians, the security specialists, the engineers, often see warning signs long before disaster strikes. But their voices are drowned out by short-term thinking and organizational inertia. By the time leadership takes the warnings seriously, it's too late. Imagine being one of those Nortel security professionals. You discover evidence of a massive, ongoing breach. You report it up the chain of command. You explain the severity of the threat. And you watch as management implements half measures, insufficient responses, token gestures that don't address the fundamental problem. Then you watch the company collapse, knowing that things might have been different if someone had listened. That's not just a professional failure. That's a tragedy. The Nortel collapse didn't just destroy a company. It destroyed families. It destroyed communities. Towns in Canada that had been economically dependent on Nortel manufacturing facilities became ghost towns. Entire ecosystems of suppliers, contractors, and service providers that existed to support Nortel vanished. And somewhere, in an office building halfway around the world, the people who had systematically stolen Nortel's secrets continued their operations, moving on to their next target, their next victim. To understand the full scope of what happened to Nortel, we need to talk about the economics of corporate espionage and the dark web economy that makes it profitable. Most people think of hackers as lone wolves in hoodies, typing furiously in dark basements. That's a Hollywood fantasy. Modern corporate espionage is big business, conducted by organized groups with resources, specialization, and government backing. In the world of state-sponsored hacking, there are essentially four major players: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Each has different motivations and targets, but they all operate sophisticated cyber espionage programs. China's approach, which is believed to be behind the Nortel attacks, focuses on economic and technological espionage. Their goal is simple: accelerate China's economic development by stealing intellectual property from Western companies. Think of it as industrial policy by other means. Instead of spending decades and billions of dollars on research and development, Chinese companies can simply acquire stolen technology from competitors, allowing them to leapfrog entire generations of innovation. The scale of this theft is staggering. The FBI has estimated that Chinese cyber espionage costs American companies alone hundreds of billions of dollars annually. When you factor in Canadian, European, and other companies, the global cost could exceed $1 trillion. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. The stolen intellectual property doesn't just benefit one company. It benefits entire industrial sectors. Let's say Chinese hackers steal telecommunications technology from Nortel. That information doesn't just go to Huawei. It flows to ZTE, to China Telecom, to dozens of other companies in the Chinese telecommunications ecosystem. The research Nortel spent hundreds of millions of dollars developing gets distributed across an entire industry. Now multiply that advantage across every sector: aviation, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, defense, energy, biotechnology. Whenever Chinese companies compete against Western firms, they do so with a profound information advantage. And it's not just about stealing finished products or technologies. The real value is in understanding your competitors' strategies. Remember those executive emails the Nortel hackers accessed? Imagine reading your competitors' internal discussions about pricing strategies before a major contract negotiation. You'd know their bottom line. You'd know how low they could go. You'd know their weaknesses, their concerns, their fallback positions. That's not just valuable. That's priceless. This creates what economists call an adverse selection problem in the global market. Companies making honest investments in R&D compete against rivals who acquired the same knowledge for free. Over time, this distorts the entire innovation ecosystem. Why spend $1 billion on research when your competitors will just steal it? The dark web economy facilitates all of this through a sophisticated marketplace where stolen data is bought and sold. Corporate credentials, intellectual property, customer databases, all available for purchase if you know where to look and have cryptocurrency to spend. Security researchers estimate that the dark web economy generates tens of billions of dollars in illicit transactions annually. And corporate espionage data is among the most valuable commodities. A database of customer information might sell for thousands of dollars. But the R&D files for a cutting-edge technology? That could be worth millions. And once data is stolen and enters this ecosystem, it's nearly impossible to contain. It gets copied, resold, distributed across multiple actors. Your company's secrets become a commodity traded among criminals, competitors, and foreign intelligence services. This was Nortel's nightmare. Their intellectual property didn't just get stolen once. It proliferated across a digital black market, amplifying the damage with each transaction. So what can we learn from Nortel's catastrophic collapse? What does this story teach us about the invisible wars being fought in cyberspace every single day? Lesson 1. Cybersecurity is not an IT problem. It's a strategic business priority. The biggest mistake Nortel made, and the mistake countless companies continue to make, is treating cybersecurity as a technical issue to be handled by IT departments, rather than a fundamental business risk that demands executive attention. When Brian Shields discovered evidence of the breach, his warnings should have triggered immediate, aggressive action at the highest levels of the company. The CEO, the board of directors, strategic advisors, everyone should have been involved in coordinating a comprehensive response. Instead, cybersecurity was siloed in IT, treated as a cost center rather than a critical strategic function. In today's digital economy, your intellectual property is your competitive advantage. Your customer relationships, your research, your strategic plans, these are the crown jewels of your business. If they're compromised, you don't have a business anymore. You have a hollow shell. Every executive, every board member needs to understand you are a target. If you have something valuable, someone wants to steal it. The question isn't whether you'll be attacked, but whether you'll detect the attack before it's too late. Lesson 2. Assume you're already compromised. This sounds paranoid, but it's actually the healthiest mindset for cybersecurity. Most companies approach security with what's called a prevention-focused mindset. They build firewalls, implement access controls, and hope those defenses will keep attackers out. But sophisticated adversaries will eventually find a way in. It might take them weeks or months, but they'll find the vulnerability. So instead of assuming your defenses are impenetrable, assume they've already been breached. That assumption changes everything. If you assume you're compromised, you implement monitoring systems to detect unusual behavior inside your network. You segment your systems so that even if attackers gain access to one area, they can't easily move to others. You regularly audit access logs looking for anomalies. This approach, called Zero Trust Architecture, has become the gold standard in cybersecurity. Trust nothing. Verify everything. Lesson 3. The weakest link is always human. The most sophisticated cybersecurity systems in the world can be defeated by one employee clicking on a malicious email. Nortel's breach likely began with a spear phishing email. Someone, somewhere in the company, clicked a link or opened an attachment they shouldn't have. This isn't about blaming that individual. Spear phishing attacks are incredibly sophisticated. They exploit psychological vulnerabilities, not just technical ones. They create urgency, appeal to authority, or leverage social engineering to manipulate targets into making mistakes. The solution isn't just technical controls. It's education, training, and creating a security-conscious culture where employees understand they're the first line of defense. Lesson 4. Nation-state attackers play the long game. If you're being targeted by a state-sponsored hacking group, you're not dealing with someone trying to make quick money. You're dealing with an adversary that can afford to spend years inside your network, waiting patiently for the right opportunities. These attackers have effectively unlimited resources, professional training, and government protection. They're not going to get caught and prosecuted. They operate with impunity from countries that actively support their activities. Defending against these adversaries requires a completely different approach than defending against common cybercriminals. It requires collaboration with intelligence agencies, sharing threat information with industry peers, and sometimes accepting that you're in a constant state of warfare where the best you can do is limit damage. Lesson 5. The geopolitics of cyberspace are real. Nortel's story is, at its core, a story about geopolitical competition in the 21st century. The rise of Chinese telecommunications companies and the simultaneous collapse of Western competitors like Nortel, Lucent, and others isn't a coincidence. It's the result of a deliberate, coordinated strategy to dominate critical technology sectors. Companies operating in strategic industries, telecommunications, defense, energy, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, need to understand that they're not just competing in a free market. They're operating in an environment where some competitors have state backing, access to stolen intellectual property, and the ability to operate outside normal legal and ethical constraints. That doesn't mean giving up or retreating, but it does mean being realistic about the challenges and demanding that governments provide better protection, better intelligence sharing, and stronger consequences for state-sponsored economic espionage. So what happened after Nortel's bankruptcy? The company's assets were carved up and sold off to competitors. Ericsson bought Nortel's wireless network business. Avia acquired the Enterprise Solutions division. Ciena purchased the optical networking and carrier Ethernet units. Nortel's patents, the intellectual property that represented decades of innovation, were sold in a massive auction for $4.5 billion to a consortium including Apple, Microsoft, Sony, and others. Think about that for a moment. A company that was once worth $300 billion was reduced to selling off its patents for $4.5 billion. The proceeds from these sales went primarily to paying off creditors and bondholders. Employees and pensioners received pennies on the dollar for what they were owed. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Nortel's collapse was on the Canadian tech sector and the broader conversation about cybersecurity. Canada lost its telecommunications champion. The country that had been a global leader in communications technology suddenly had no major player in the industry. The economic and strategic implications of this loss continue to reverberate today. Meanwhile, the companies that allegedly benefited from stolen Nortel technology continued to grow. Huawei became the world's largest telecommunications equipment manufacturer, with operations in over 170 countries. They became so dominant that Western governments eventually grew concerned about national security implications and began banning Huawei equipment from sensitive networks. The irony is almost painful. The technology that built Huawei may have been stolen from a Western company, and now Western governments are trying to ban the resulting products. Brian Shields, the security advisor who discovered the breach, became a cybersecurity consultant and continues to speak publicly about the lessons from Nortel. His warnings about state-sponsored corporate espionage, once dismissed as paranoia, are now accepted as established fact by security professionals worldwide. The FBI, the NSA, and intelligence agencies across the Western world have become far more vocal about the threats posed by Chinese cyber espionage. But whether this represents too little, too late remains an open question. For former Nortel employees, the story remains deeply personal. Online forums and social media groups dedicated to Nortel alumni share memories, frustrations, and theories about what really happened. Many remain convinced that if the cyber attacks had been detected earlier, if management had taken the threat seriously, if governments had provided better protection, Nortel might have survived. We'll never know for sure, but their suspicions aren't unfounded. What we do know is this: Nortel's collapse wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions, specific vulnerabilities, and specific attacks that could have been prevented or at least mitigated. And that makes the story even more tragic. Now here's the part of the story that should keep you up at night. Everything that happened to Nortel is happening right now to companies around the world. According to recent studies, the average time to detect a cybersecurity breach is over 200 days. That means attackers have more than 6 months of unrestricted access to your systems before you even know they're there. 6 months. Think about what could be stolen in 6 months. Every email, every document, every strategic plan, every customer record, every piece of intellectual property you've worked years to develop. And remember, Nortel was breached for at least 4 years before anyone discovered it. In some cases, security researchers have found evidence of attackers maintaining persistent access for over a decade. A decade of watching, waiting, and stealing. Major corporations, government agencies, and research institutions all are being systematically compromised by sophisticated adversaries who operate with patience and professionalism. If you run a company, if you're an executive, if you're responsible for protecting your organization's digital assets, you need to ask yourself some hard questions. When was the last time we conducted a comprehensive security audit? Do we have systems in place to detect unusual network activity? Are our executives using strong, unique passwords, preferably with multi-factor authentication? Do our employees receive regular training on cybersecurity threats? Have we segmented our network so that a breach in one area doesn't compromise everything? Do we have an incident response plan for when, not if, we discover a breach? Are we monitoring for indicators that our intellectual property might be appearing in competitors' products? These aren't paranoid questions. These are basic due diligence in the modern economy. And if you're an employee, you're not off the hook either. You're part of your company's security ecosystem. That means, be skeptical of unexpected emails, even if they appear to come from colleagues or business partners. Never click on links or open attachments unless you're absolutely certain they're legitimate. Use strong, unique passwords for every account. Report suspicious activity immediately to your IT security team. Understand that you're a target and act accordingly. The hackers who targeted Nortel didn't go away. They just moved on to their next victims. And those victims might include your employer, your business, or organizations you care about. The story of Nortel is more than a cautionary tale about corporate collapse. It's a window into the invisible wars being fought in cyberspace every single day. While we go about our lives, checking emails, browsing websites, conducting business, sophisticated adversaries are probing our defenses, looking for weaknesses, waiting for opportunities. They're patient, they're professional, and they're winning. Nortel was a Canadian tech giant, a pioneer of telecommunications, a company that helped build the internet infrastructure we all rely on today. And they were systematically destroyed by adversaries who stole their secrets, undermined their competitive position, and ultimately contributed to their collapse. 95,000 people lost their jobs. Billions of dollars in value evaporated. An entire nation lost its telecommunications champion. But the scariest part? This wasn't a unique event. It's happening constantly to companies large and small, across every industry, in every country. The boardroom is bugged. The question is, are you paying attention? If this story has made you think differently about cybersecurity, if it's made you realize the stakes of the invisible wars being fought in cyberspace, then share this video with someone who needs to see it. A business owner, an executive, a colleague who thinks their company is too small to be a target. Because Nortel thought they were too big to fail. And they were wrong. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more deep dives into the hidden stories of corporate espionage, industrial sabotage, and the dark side of the digital economy. We're just getting started, and trust me, the stories get even more unbelievable. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think your company could be compromised right now? What are you doing to protect yourself? And remember, in the age of digital warfare, ignorance isn't bliss. It's a liability. Thanks for watching. Stay vigilant out there.